Story 1. The Andersons had recently moved into an old Victorian house that had been vacant for years. The house was imposing and foreboding, with its dark, looming towers and stained glass windows. But the Andersons were drawn to its charm and character, and they were eager to make it their home. The first few weeks were peaceful. The Andersons settled in quickly, and they began to explore the house and its grounds. But one fateful night, a chilling event occurred. Mr. Anderson had gone to the basement to fetch some tools, leaving his wife, Sarah, on the first floor. He was about to climb the stairs to return when he heard a strange noise behind him. He turned around, but there was nothing there. He shrugged it off and continued up the stairs. But as he reached the top, the basement door slammed shut behind him, locking him inside. Mr. Anderson pounded on the door and shouted for help, but no one could hear him. The basement was dark and silent, and he could feel the air around him growing colder and colder. Suddenly he heard a whispering sound. He strained his ears to listen, but he couldn't make out the words. The whispering grew louder, and now he could hear multiple voices, all speaking at once. Mr. Anderson backed away from the door, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't know what was happening, but he knew he was in danger. He turned and ran towards the other side of the basement, but the walls seemed to close in around him. He felt like he was trapped in a maze with no way out. He stumbled and fell, and the whispering voices grew even louder. He could feel hands on him, pulling him down into the darkness. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. He was being dragged away, deeper and deeper into the basement. Upstairs, Sarah was growing increasingly concerned. She had heard her husband's screams for help, but she couldn't open the basement door. She ran to the kitchen and grabbed a crowbar. She smashed it against the door, but it wouldn't budge. She ran to the window and shouted for help, but there was no one around. She was all alone. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Sarah managed to open the basement door with the help of a neighbor who had heard her screams. They rushed down the stairs, but it was too late. Mr. Anderson was lying on the ground, lifeless. His face was contorted in fear, and his eyes were wide open. Sarah screamed and collapsed to her knees. She couldn't believe what had happened. Her husband was gone, and she had no idea what had killed him. The police investigated Mr. Anderson's death, but they were unable to find any evidence of foul play. The basement door was still locked from the inside, and there were no signs of forced entry. The Andersons were devastated by Mr. Anderson's death, and they quickly moved out of the house. But the mystery of what happened to Mr. Anderson remains unsolved to this day. Story 2. The Petersons had lived in their quaint, historic house for several years. They had grown accustomed to its quirks and oddities, but there was one thing that never ceased to bother them: the hidden room. They had discovered the room shortly after moving in, but they had never been able to open it. The door was always locked, and no key seemed to fit. One day, their daughter Emily disappeared. The Petersons searched the entire house, but she was nowhere to be found. They were about to call the police when they heard a noise coming from the hidden room. Mr. Peters rushed to the door and broke it down. He found Emily inside, huddled in a corner, her eyes filled with terror. "Emily!" Mrs. Peters cried, running to her daughter. "What happened?" Emily looked at her parents with wide eyes. "I was playing in the attic," she said, "when I heard a voice. It called my name." "What did the voice say?" Mr. Peters asked. "It told me to come to the hidden room," Emily said. "I was scared, but I went anyway." "And then what happened?" Mrs. Peters asked. "It locked the door," Emily said, "and then it told me that I was never going to leave." The Petersons were horrified. They didn't know what to do. They couldn't leave their daughter in the hidden room, but they also didn't know how to get her out. Suddenly, a cold wind blew through the room, and the door to the hidden room slammed shut. It locked itself from the inside. The Petersons heard a voice from behind the door. "She's mine now," the voice said, "and there's nothing you can do about it." The Petersons stood there for a long time, frozen in fear. They didn't know what to do. They had lost their daughter to the sinister entity that dwelled within their home. Story 3. John Mitchell was a wealthy businessman who had always been fascinated by the paranormal. When he heard about the historic mansion with a reputation for being cursed, he knew he had to have it. The mansion was located on a hill overlooking a small town. It was a grand old building with a Victorian turret and stained glass windows, but it had a dark aura about it, as if it was steeped in tragedy. John moved into the mansion and quickly began to experience strange things. At night, he would hear eerie sounds, whispers, footsteps, and faint, ghostly music. He would wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, his heart pounding. But the worst happened at 3 a.m. every night. Without fail, John would fall inexplicably ill. He would be overcome by a wave of nausea and dizziness. His heart would race, and his breath would come in short gasps. He would feel as if he was being suffocated by an invisible force. John's friends and family became increasingly concerned for his well-being. They tried to convince him to leave the mansion, but he refused. He was determined to uncover the truth behind the curse. One night, a group of John's friends decided to hold a paranormal investigation at the mansion. They brought cameras, recorders, and other equipment to document any evidence of paranormal activity. The group spent the night in the mansion, and they experienced some truly terrifying things. They heard the same eerie sounds that John had been hearing. They saw shadows moving in the darkness, and they felt cold spots throughout the house. But the most disturbing thing happened at 3 a.m. John woke up with a scream. He was sitting up in bed, his eyes wide with terror. "It's here!" he cried. "It's here!" The group rushed to John's room. They found him clutching his chest, gasping for air. "What's wrong?" one of his friends asked. "It's the curse," John said. "It's trying to kill me." John's friends tried to calm him down, but it was no use. He was too terrified. He was convinced that the malevolent forces that haunted the mansion were trying to kill him. John's friends stayed with him for the rest of the night. They tried to comfort him, but they were all shaken by what they had experienced. The next morning, the group left the mansion. They were determined to help John, but they didn't know how. They delved into the mansion's dark history, hoping to find a clue to the curse. They discovered that the mansion had been built on the site of an ancient burial ground. They also learned that several previous owners of the mansion had died under mysterious circumstances. The group realized that they were dealing with something powerful and malevolent. They knew that they needed to find a way to free John from the curse, but they didn't know where to start. Story 4. The Richardson family had recently moved into a quaint cottage on the outskirts of town. The cottage was charming and inviting, with its white picket fence and manicured garden. But the Richardsons soon realized that something was not quite right. One day, Mrs. Richardson found a doll sitting on the doorstep. It was a porcelain doll with long, flowing hair and a painted-on smile. Mrs. Richardson thought it was a strange gift, but she brought it inside and placed it on the mantelpiece. That night, Mrs. Richardson woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of laughter. She opened her eyes and saw the doll standing at the foot of her bed. The doll was staring at her with its glassy eyes, and its smile was now twisted into a malevolent grin. Mrs. Richardson screamed and turned on the light. The doll was gone. The next morning, Mrs. Richardson told her husband about what had happened. He didn't believe her at first, but then he found the doll sitting on the kitchen table. The Richardsons decided to get rid of the doll. They threw it in the trash, but it reappeared on the doorstep the next day. They tried burning it, burying it, and even driving it to a remote location and abandoning it, but the doll always found its way back. Each time the doll reappeared, its smile became more sinister and its eyes more malevolent. The Richardsons were terrified. They didn't know what to do. The Richardsons' sleepless nights turned into living nightmares. They were constantly on edge, waiting for the doll to make its next appearance. The community began to whisper of a dark curse that had befallen the Richardson house. Some people said that the doll was possessed by a demon. Others said that it was the spirit of a tormented child. The Richardsons were desperate. They sought help from paranormal experts and mediums, hoping to break the sinister doll's hold over their lives. But no one could help them. The doll was relentless. It always found its way back. Story 5. The Johnson family had been residing in their charming suburban home for several years. It was a cozy 2-story house with a white picket fence and a well-manicured lawn. The Johnsons had always felt a sense of tranquility within its walls, but their lives took a sinister turn when an unexpected visitor arrived one evening. A woman, disheveled and with a haunted look in her eyes, knocked on their door. She was dressed in tattered clothes and her hair was matted and tangled. Her eyes were sunken and bloodshot and her skin was pale and drawn. The Johnsons opened the door and the woman introduced herself as Eleanor. She explained that she used to live in their house, but she had to move out abruptly a few years ago. "I'm here to warn you," she said. "This house is evil. It's plagued by malevolent spirits." The Johnsons were skeptical at first. They had never experienced anything unusual in their house before, but Eleanor's genuine fear and desperation were contagious. "I suffered nightmarish horrors during my time here," she said. "I couldn't bear to see another family suffer the same fate." Eleanor told the Johnsons stories of the strange and terrifying things she had experienced in the house. She said that she had heard disembodied voices, seen shadowy figures, and felt cold spots throughout the house. She said that objects would move on their own, and that doors and windows would open and close by themselves. The Johnsons didn't know what to believe. They had never experienced anything like this before, but Eleanor's stories planted a seed of doubt in their minds. That night, as the Johnsons settled into their beds, strange things began to happen. The temperature in the house dropped dramatically, even though it was a warm summer night. Eerie whispers echoed through the halls, and shadowy figures darted across their peripheral vision. Doors slammed shut, seemingly on their own accord, and chilling cries filled the air. The Johnsons were terrified. They didn't know what to do. They huddled together in their bed, listening to the strange noises and feeling helpless. Suddenly, they heard a loud crash coming from downstairs. They jumped out of bed and ran to the top of the stairs. They saw that the living room was in ruins. Furniture was overturned, and pictures were smashed on the floor. The Johnsons realized that Eleanor's warning had been legitimate. Their house was truly haunted. They knew that they had to leave, but they didn't know where to go. They were trapped in a house with malevolent spirits, and they didn't know how to escape.